series, Faith, Forgiveness, and Prayer, Finding Meaning in the Days of Awe. If you have missed any sessions, you can find recordings on our website. Just search Faith, Forgiveness, and Prayer on the JTS website. And if it's your first time joining us for the series today, special welcome. We're very pleased to have Professor Benjamin Sommer teaching us today, Professor of Bible and Ancient Semitic Languages at JTS. His session is called From Self-Interest to Self-Surrender, Confronting the Challenges of Prayer. And I think hopefully we'll find some paradigm shifting, challenging new ways of thinking about prayer today as we enter into a season that we traditionally associate with so much prayer. Just a few technical notes. So for asking questions, we will use the raise hand feature in Zoom. The chat on this in this series has become very active, which is fine, but please know that we are not asking the faculty to monitor the chat because we want them to be able to focus on teaching. They may here and there see what's in the chat, but if you want to ask a question, the way to do that is to use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and that allows us also to hear people's voices a little bit. To find that feature, you click on participants and then look for an icon that looks like a hand. You can click that hand to raise or lower, and feel free to test it out. Lynn Feynman will be moderating questions today, so when we get to Q&A, which we'll have periodically throughout the class, Lynn will call your name, send you an unmute message, and then you go ahead and unmute yourself.
Julia, I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't know if a couple people in the chat are asking for it to be a little bit louder. I don't know if you saw that. So
checking my settings.
I don't know if it's in your settings. I think if maybe just
okay. I'll speak louder.
Thank you.
Is there anything that I should repeat that I already said? I'll just repeat that we are using to ask questions. We're not using the chat. We're using the raise hand feature in Zoom, which you find by clicking on participants and then clicking on the hand icon. And if you're participating by phone today, you can raise your hand by dialing *9. And I think that actually is it. So I apologize if you couldn't hear me. And I will turn it over now to Professor Sommer to teach us.
Good point. Okay, sorry about that. I forgot to unmute. Toda rabah to Julia and to Tani and Lynn for organizing all of this, and to all of you for attending this class today. I think I'll just jump right in and remind you what the topic is that I'm talking about. One way of describing what I want to address today is that I want to ask the question, as we get ready for the holiday season in which we spend in a normal year so much time in synagogue, although of course that won't be happening quite in the normal way this year. We spend so much time in the synagogue reciting a huge set of set prayers. I want to ask the question, why are we so bad at prayer? Why are we modern Jews? Why are we capital C conservative Jews? Why are we so bad at prayer? And I must emphasize right off the bat, but that by we, I do mean we. I'm including myself in this we. Although I am a scholar who specializes in, among other things, I specialize in prayer as a scholarly subject. And although I am a religious Jew and I do daven every single day, the truth of the matter is that I'm really bad at prayer. I'm good at talking about prayer, but I'm not really that good at doing it, even though I do it every single day. It was just a few hours ago that I put tefillah on and recited the morning service, the shacharit service. And yet I think, like a great many modern Jews, I have a great deal of difficulty davening with kavanah. I have a great deal of difficulty praying with the full intention and the fullness of my spirit, that really should be the ideal of prayer. I'm pretty good at the easy stuff. I'm pretty good at actually just making sure that every single day I observe the Jewish commandment to pray on a daily basis. That part is easy, and that I do on a daily basis. But davening with kavanah, really putting my whole heart and soul into the meaning of the words and the meaning of the experience as a whole, I'm really not that great at it. It is rare that I daven with kavanah, I'm sorry to say. And I think that what's true of me is true of a great many modern Jews. I am in conservative synagogues on a regular basis, or at least I was before COVID. That is to say, not only the shul that I belong to here in Teaneck, New Jersey, but I'm often a scholar in residence at various conservative synagogues around the country. And I think it's fair to say that the truth is, you go to a modern synagogue, you go to a capital C conservative synagogue, and there's not a huge amount of davening going on. There's not a huge amount of praying going on. There are a great many committed, loyal Jews who show up on Friday night or on Saturday morning, who show up and sit down in a pew, in a chair, and then somehow end up not really praying all that much. I think that some of you may have different experiences. Some of you may go to synagogues where this is not the case. But if so, I think that those synagogues are exceptional. Some of you also may have a different experience because you really are good at davening in a way that I personally am not. But in that case, again, you are in a wonderful way exceptional. The truth of the matter is, I think that there's very little davening going on at modern shuls, even though the people who are showing up on a regular basis are committed, loyal, enthusiastic Jews. If you know what I'm talking about, if you share my curiosity or my disquiet at this situation, then what I'd like to do over the next hour is I'd like to analyze the problem. I don't intend to solve the problem over the next hour, but what I intend to do is to talk about why, especially for us modern liberal Jews, prayer is such a challenge. A challenge is a good thing. It's not a bad thing to be challenged, but to meet the challenge, I think we have to understand the nature of the challenge. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is I'd like to spend some time talking about the reasons I think that we have so much difficulty with prayer, and especially with traditional Jewish prayer, the prayers of the Siddur, the prayers of the Machzor. So let me talk about two problems right off the bat to begin with. I'd like to talk first about one problem, which is God. And I'd like to talk about a second problem, which is the Siddur. So let's start off with problem number one. Problem number one for us, or challenge number one, is God. Well, for one thing, not everybody who is a committed, religiously involved, communally involved Jew really believes in God. Now, if you don't believe in God, prayer naturally is going to be more difficult, although not necessarily impossible. There are traditions around the world in which prayer is a part of the religious tradition, even though there are there's no personal or conventional notion of a deity. So that on its own is not necessarily the whole problem. Let me move on, though, to, I think, the situation of many people who attend synagogue on a regular basis, which is, I think, that even many modern Jews who believe in God may not believe that God is a personal being who listens to prayer, to the prayer of individuals, or who responds to specific prayers. I think a great many people have a more abstract notion of God, and the question of how prayer, how a discussion, a verbal interaction with a more abstract God the question of how prayer works with that more abstract notion of God is a significant question. Now, this issue that not everybody has a view of God, that God listens to individuals' prayers and responds to them in a specific manner, this issue is not actually a new issue. That this is not actually an issue only for modern liberal Jews. Already in the Middle Ages, rationalist Jewish philosophers, and for that matter also rationalist Christian and rationalist Muslim philosophers, already believed that, number one, God is perfect. Number two, to say that God is perfect means that God is unchanging. A perfect being does not change, because any change in a perfect being would render that being imperfect. So number one, God is perfect. Number two, that means God is unchanging. And if God is unchanging, then number three, prayer cannot change God. So already for rationalist Jewish philosophers, especially for Maimonides, for Rambam, who to this day, 800 years later, is still considered the greatest and the most important Jewish philosopher, already from Rambam, prayer is a challenging subject, because Rambam believes that prayer cannot possibly alter God's behavior. Prayer cannot change God. If you think about the three main types of prayer, usually we talk about prayer as falling into three main types: petition, praise, and thanksgiving. If you think of these three main types of prayer, petition, praise, and thanksgiving, from a rationalist point of view, from Maimonides' point of view in his great philosophical work, The Guide of the Perplexed, at least two of these are very, very problematic. What is the point of petition if we're praying to an omniscient, all-knowing, perfect God? First of all, God knows what we need and what we want anyway. There's no need for us verbally to tell God this. God knew a million years ago what we would want on this particular Monday morning. So there's no need to tell God. And even more importantly, as far as petition goes, what's the point of petitioning God when prayer cannot change God? It's not going to change God's behavior. Petitionary prayer doesn't seem all that logical. Praise, similarly, seems to be problematic. Whatever praise of God we enunciate, God already knows that about God. If we say God is great, that God is merciful, well, God knows that God is great. God knows that God is merciful. God knows everything. God is omniscient. So again, praise is not so clear. The only sort of prayer that seems a bit more a bit more understandable, a bit more logical, is thanksgiving, because thanksgiving is something that we might need to do. It might be good for us, even if it's unnecessary for God. It's good for a person to be thankful. It's good for a person who feels thankful to express thanksgiving. So this is not a modern problem. The idea of a perfect God being somewhat incompatible with prayer, this is a problem that already medieval Jewish philosophers and halachic authorities dealt with. Maimonides does say that every single Jew is required to pray on a daily basis, but it's an interesting question. Why does Maimonides think that that's a requirement, given that petition cannot change prayer and praise cannot tell anything about God that God doesn't already know? I'm going to come back to Maimonides in a little bit, but I want to move on at this point as I'm describing the challenges. What makes prayer challenging for us modern Jews, for us liberal Jews, for us capital C conservative Jews? I want to move on to, I think, what might be an even bigger problem, which is the problem of the Siddur. I think that we modern people have a problem with praying from the Siddur, from a prayer book, because I think that modern Western people, modern Americans, tend to have a problem with what we might call formal prayer or formulaic prayer. That is, with prayer that has to take place at set times and and that has a set, predetermined, more or less one-size-fits-all set of wording. I think that many modern people, consciously or perhaps more often unconsciously, tend to assume the following. I think that modern Western individuals tend to assume that if prayer is truly meaningful, it must be prayer that is spontaneous and deeply personal and individual. Prayers that consist of our own words, our own thoughts, our own gestures, those are the real prayers, not prayers that come prepackaged in a siddur, in a Jewish siddur, or in a Catholic missal, or in the Muslim tzalat. Um, Prayers that come prepackaged, some people feel, are not real prayers. There's actually probably the most famous book within the academic field of religious studies about prayer is a book that was published nearly 100 years ago by a German scholar named Friedrich Heiler. And in that very, very influential book, a book simply entitled Prayer, that was published in English translation in 1932. The original came out about 10 years earlier. Heiler argues that what we find in a Catholic missal, in the Muslim tzalat, in the Jewish set prayers that we can find in a siddur, that those aren't real prayers. Those are just samples. Those are just examples to give you a sense of what your prayer might be like. But real prayer comes from the individual's heart. Real prayer is spontaneous, not at set times. Real prayer is what comes from your heart or comes from your mind in your own words, not the set words of, let's say, the Jewish siddur. Now, that particular view of prayer, which I think is a very common one among modern Western religious individuals, whether they realize it fully or not, it's important to know where that particular view of prayer that I just summarized comes from. The idea that real prayer is free, uncompelled, and totally individual, that is not a Jewish view of prayer. It is also not a Catholic view of prayer, or a Muslim view of prayer, or a Hindu view of prayer. Even going into Protestant Christianity, it's not a particularly Episcopalian or Lutheran view of prayer. The truth is, the view of prayer that I just summarized is especially at home in what is known as low church or pietistic Protestantism. On the handout that I've given you, towards the top of the first page, it's actually the second little area on that first page, I talk about low church or pietistic or deeply individual forms of Christianity. These are forms of Christianity that put a tremendous emphasis on the individual and the individual's own religious experience. This particular kind of Christianity includes Quakerism. It includes a lot of Calvinist Christianity, that is to say the Puritan or Congregationalist tradition in Christianity, the Reformed tradition, the Dutch Reformed tradition, and the Presbyterian traditions. It includes the Baptist denominations that evolved alongside or in some ways out of Calvinist traditions. It includes Methodist traditions and also Mennonite traditions. Now, that's an important list for us Americans because you might have noticed that most, not all, but most of the people who founded America were on the list that I just gave. New England, of the three main regions that founded America, New England, the Middle Colonies, and the South, New England was founded by and originally entirely populated by Calvinists, specifically by Puritans or Congregationalists. The Middle Colonies, well, New York, New Amsterdam was originally founded by Reformed Christians, also Calvinists. Appalachia and parts of the Middle Colonies, and parts of Appalachia going down to the South was settled by Presbyterians, also from the Calvinist traditions. Really the South, actually I should add, Quakers founded parts of the Middle Colonies. Methodists were an important part of the founding of a whole different part, whole parts of the United States. Really, the only part of the United States originally that wasn't founded by people who were low church was the South, where we have an interaction of Episcopalians, but also Methodists, some Presbyterians, and Baptists. So the South is the only area where we're not getting almost totally low church traditions. We're getting a mix of low church traditions and other kinds of Protestant traditions, and in Maryland, Catholics as well. The reason I'm pausing to talk about all this American history is because I think it's very, very important for us as Jews to realize that in the United States of America, the default understanding of religion is Protestant, and it tends to be low church Protestant. The way that Americans think of the category of religion is a Protestant way of understanding religion, and especially a low church Protestant way of understanding religion. And that affects all of us. What I'm suggesting is that most American Jews, including a great many Orthodox Jews, make assumptions about Judaism that don't come from Judaism, that don't come from Jewish tradition, but that come from American culture, and those are ultimately low church Protestant assumptions. Back when I used to teach at Northwestern University before I came to JTS, I remember one of my colleagues who taught Catholic theology talking about how difficult it was to teach even Catholic students at Northwestern University in Illinois about Catholic theology, because even the Catholic students had fundamentally Protestant assumptions about religion. One of my colleagues who taught Islam talked about how Muslims born in America tended to look at Islam through Protestant lenses. He said at Northwestern we had a fair number of students who were Muslim who were born in Pakistan or India or sometimes from the Arab world. The ones who were born elsewhere, they got Islam. They understood Islam through Islamic lenses. But Muslims born in America, the ones who had no accent, who grew up playing baseball, they had trouble understanding crucial ideas about Islam because they were looking at a non-Protestant religion through Protestant lenses. And I think that happens enormously often in Judaism, that we American Jews look at Judaism through Protestant lenses. So when we think about what prayer really is, or what prayer should be, or what the ideal prayer is, I think that unconsciously we're already biased against the Siddur. We're biased against the prayer book, because we think that someone else's words, that can't be my own real prayer. My own prayer has to come from my own heart in my own words at the moment that the Spirit moves me. That phrase, which I put onto the handout, when the Spirit moves me, that does actually describe how and when prayer is supposed to occur in a Quaker context. That's a phrase that was used often by George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, in an actual Quaker meeting. Everything is silent until someone at the meeting believes that the Holy Spirit, that is the second person of the Trinity, or what allows that divine aspect that allows a person to speak as a prophet, they are quiet until the Holy Spirit moves somebody. And in traditional Quakerism, in the original forms of Quakerism, which still exist in some parts of America, especially the western parts of America and the Midwest, in traditional Quakerism, you are silent at meeting until you think the Spirit has moved you. That same phrase is used also among some Calvinist theologians of the 17th century. And I think it has a lot of influence in American culture. That phrase has a lot of influence in American culture, well beyond Quakerism or Calvinism. But it's not a Jewish way of thinking about prayer. A Jewish way of thinking about prayer is that, yes, individual prayer is fine, but what's even more important is prayer that comes from the Siddur, whose words are prescribed for us. So I'd like to come back to to talking about this a little bit, but let me just sum up what I've just been talking about here. I think the low church Protestant understanding of prayer that unconsciously influences what we American Jews think about prayer, it tends to be a view that values the individual over the community, freedom over duty, faith over works. Now, insofar as it values especially the individual over the community and freedom over duty, it's very clear that that view of prayer is very much an American viewpoint. It's American culture. values the individual, values freedom to the expense of community and to the expense of duty. But that is not a Jewish view of prayer. That is not a Jewish view of culture. Judaism, like Catholicism, like Islam, like Hinduism, Judaism, I think, puts a tremendous amount of emphasis on community and on duty and on works. That doesn't say that, that doesn't mean that individual freedom and faith are unimportant in Judaism or in Catholicism or in Islam. But I think that we've got an opposite hierarchy of cultural or religious values compared to American culture. And what I'm pointing to right now is, frankly, this is an arena in which our American identity and our Jewish identity are very much, I think, at odds with each other. The fact of the matter is that traditional Judaism is strikingly and uncomfortably countercultural in an American context. And for some of us to think about, gosh, why, even though I feel like a loyal Jew and I go to shul all the time, why am I having so much trouble davening from the Siddur? I think we have to realize that, well, the Siddur is a traditional Jewish document, and traditional Judaism is massively countercultural from an American point of view. So in light of these two problems that I've described, our problem maybe with God, and also very significantly, our problem with the Siddur, I think that we need to ask, what is prayer worth? What can it mean for me? And most of all, as we're getting prepared for 3 days in synagogue, starting, about 3 weeks from now, where we methodically move through dozens and dozens, hundreds of pages of formal set liturgy whose wording is there for us in advance, I want to ask the question, why is it religiously and personally meaningful to utter prayers whose wording other people wrote a long time ago and very far away? In other words, I want to ask, why does it make sense to use the Siddur's words rather than, or in addition to, our own words of prayer? And also, as part of that, why does it make sense to utter petition and praise to an all-knowing God who doesn't need to hear our petitions and doesn't need to hear our praise? I'd like to address that as well. Let me pause though here and see, Tani, if you could handle this for me, if there are any raised hands, or I don't know if it's Tani or Julia, but somebody can handle this for me. Do we have any questions now? Because we've been going for almost a half hour and I just want to pause and make sure people are with me.
Yes, and I just wanted to repeat, since I apologize, my mic volume was low at the beginning. We're taking questions using the raise hand feature in Zoom, not using the chat. So do not expect the faculty in this lovely series to see everything you're writing in the chat. We want them to focus on their teaching. Okay, that said, Adrian, let's hear from you. Tani, it's not letting me. I'm clicking ask to. Okay, there we go.
Hi, when we first started, you said that you recited your morning prayers rather than using the word, I prayed my morning prayers. And so that's one question I have. I don't think most Christians would say they recite. I know Muslims do, but Christians don't say I recite, they say I pray. And the second thing about the Siddur is I wonder how much the problem is Hebrew versus English.
Mm-hmm. Great questions, Adrienne. First of all, I did say, and I really appreciate that you paid attention to my word choice, because I do try to be careful about word choice. I did say that I recited the morning prayers rather than I prayed the morning prayers, because I began by admitting that, like, I'm really bad at praying. And I do think that, unfortunately, it is my tendency every morning to recite the Shacharit service rather than to pray the morning service. It would be better if I could pray the morning service, but if I'm speaking honestly, I don't know that I can really say I truly prayed the morning service. I recited the correct words, but I'm just not a very spiritual guy. I'm tremendously interested in religion, obviously, but I'm just like, there are people who are just good at spirituality, just like there are people who have perfect pitch, and there are people who are really musical, and then there are people like who, they don't sing on tune so much. The great theoretician of religion, the German scholar Rudolf Otto, talked about how religion is like music. It's something that's just part of all human cultures. All human individuals can have a relationship with it, but some people are better at it than others, or just better at it naturally. I'm just not a very spiritual person, and so I have to work really hard to make it from reciting the prayers to praying the prayers. And I use that phrase deliberately this morning because that's the honest, if somewhat unfortunate way to describe what I do most mornings at least. At the same time, Judaism is a religion, like Catholicism, like Islam, where there is a great deal of value that is put on reciting the prayers. Even if you can't truly, in the deepest way, pray the prayers every day, it is still valuable and indeed required for us Jews to pray, at least to recite the prayers every day. And in all likelihood, if we're ever going to make it to praying the prayers, it's only because we already have the habit of reciting the prayers. Some of what I'm saying might sound sort of down and pessimistic, but I think if you think about it, it's actually the opposite. Because part of what I'm saying is that Judaism doesn't judge us if we get up one morning and nebuch, all we can do is recite the prayers. It's not saying, oh, you must be a bad Jew because you can't really pray the prayers with kavanah. No, you can still be a very, very fine Jew, even if you're not a spiritual person. Reciting the prayers, it's not as good as praying the prayers, but reciting the prayers, that's good too. And so in a way, actually, I think what I'm saying is really is both optimistic, and it points towards an aspect of Judaism that is very, very accepting. It says to us, even if you have a hard time praying, even if you're angry at God, which you may have good reason to be, that doesn't mean you can't observe this important commandment from God. Even a person who's doubting the existence of God, even a person who thinks that God does exist and is angry at God, even a person like me who's just not all that spiritual, can still be very successful on a daily basis at reciting the prayers. So anyway, that was a long answer. I hope that spoke to what you're getting at.
In English versus Hebrew?
Thank you. Yeah, two-part questions. I'll always forget part two. I think that's certainly part of it, but it's not all of it, because when I'm talking about how we're bad at prayer, frankly, where I daven, it's people who know Hebrew, except when I'm con residents elsewhere. I'm always davening either at a minyan at JTS, for mincha, or depending on my schedule for shacharit, or at a shul in Teaneck, where an enormous number of people know Hebrew extremely, extremely well. Actually, somebody was commenting on how many people from this series that JTS is doing that we're participating in, how many of them are from our shul. And yet it's still a problem there. So I don't think it's just English versus Hebrew, because one can know Hebrew well and still have this problem. Furthermore, we have to remember that according to Jewish law, praying in the vernacular, praying in whatever language works for you, is perfectly, perfectly acceptable. Jewish law says you can discharge your responsibility, your obligation to pray, doing it in whatever language you want. You don't have to pray in English. That halachically, this is something that sometimes people don't realize, but the halacha is very, very clear on this. Praying in English is perfectly, perfectly fine, and the Siddur gives you have a wide variety of Siddurim to choose from that give you a variety of translations. So I think what you're bringing up is part of it. I'm a little more interested in this other aspect of it, that I think the idea of a set liturgy is just very out of step with American culture.
Thanks, Adrian. Just a couple of notes. I don't know if people on the call right now had friends or relatives who were trying to get on. We were supposed to have a 500-person limit, and it was in error at 300. So that has just been fixed. If you happen to hear from people who were not able to get on, you can let them know that they now can. And of course, we'll send out the recording as well. Professor Sommer, we have about 1 million questions. So you want to take 1 or 2 more and then continue teaching, or you want to go back to teaching now?
Let's take 1 more and then I'll go back to teaching.
Great. Okay, Sarah Brooks. Okay. Go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, Sarah.
Okay, now I am, right? All right.
Very good, we hear you.
Okay, thanks. I want to push back on the idea of the notion of perfection being unchanging, because Moses changes God a lot of times. So does Aaron. He says, heal Miriam, and he does. I think God evolves a lot through just the Torah, never mind the Tanakh.
Yeah.
So, and like an earthquake building in Los Angeles, flexibility makes it perfect.
Mm-hmm. I think you're 100% right, Sarah. The medieval conception of God as perfect and therefore unchanging, which we find in the philosophy of Maimonides and other rationalist philosophers from the Middle Ages, I think is actually out of step with the theology, the various theologies of the Bible and of rabbinic literature. I very much agree with you. The God of the Bible, the God of rabbinic literature, the God of Kabbalah, is not unchanging, and either is not perfect, or, as you're suggesting, maybe is perfect, but there's a different view of what perfection means. Maybe flexibility is an admirable characteristic that is part of perfection. And I think Maimonides would argue against that, but I think that what you're suggesting is a definition of divine perfection that works much, much better for the Torah, for other parts of the Bible, for rabbinic literature, and for Jewish mysticism, and for the various Kabbalistic traditions. Nonetheless, for better or for worse, Maimonides' view, which initially was actually really quite radical and quite out of place in Judaism, has been absorbed into Jewish tradition. And I think that many modern, more rationally oriented Jews, as opposed to maybe more mystically oriented Jews, more or less agree with Maimonides on this. And that's the person to whom I'm speaking to. We could have a whole additional session on prayer that takes a more Kabbalistic point of view, in which case the idea that prayer in some sense changes aspects of God that interact with the world, that interact or are present in the cosmos, would not be a problem. I think that for most American Jews, or for many American Jews, that's a little weird. And so for today's session, I'm kind of assuming a more Maimonidean starting point. I don't necessarily agree with that starting point myself. One of my books, my book on God's bodies, is in some sense really one long anti-Maimonides polemic. But because I think there are a great many American Jews who either are more rationalist and logical in their approach, or sometimes are, I think that is sometimes where the problems with prayer come from, and I'm responding to that. But you are 100% right that the Maimonidean view of God that I was talking about is not the only view of God in Judaism, and indeed before Maimonides, it was by no means the standard view of God in Judaism. Okay, there are more questions, I'm sure, but I'd like to get going, and we'll have some more time for questions before we break. So again, just to stress what I just said before the questions, right now the practical questions that I've moved us towards are, why is it personally and religiously meaningful to utter prayers whose wording other people wrote a long time ago, far, far away? That is, why does it make sense to use the wording of the Siddur rather than our own? And that's a problem that even if you agree with Sarah and the Bible and rabbinic literature that God isn't perfect in the philosophical sense, that's still an issue that needs attention. And for those who do agree with Maimonides, why does it make sense to utter petitions to an all-knowing God who does not change? There are a number of different answers to these questions, but in the time that we've got, I'd like to stress an answer that goes to the heart of what I think at least is the heart of religious life. I'd like to suggest that a fixed statutory prayer whose wording is given to us is above all a matter of two central religious values or two central Jewish values. One is the value of anava or humility. So one is humility, anava, and the other is the value of musar, which is probably best translated, I think, as self-discipline or self-instruction. Musar is sometimes translated into English as ethics, but that doesn't really capture what the word musar means or how it functions in Jewish thought. Musar is really a matter of self-discipline or self-instruction. So let me start with the latter, with musar, and then I'll move on to anava. Let me start with self-discipline, and then I'll move to humility. One common view of petitionary prayer among religious philosophers, you see this in Rambam, you see this in Thomas Aquinas, who has a very similar place in Catholicism that Rambam has for us, is that the point of petitionary prayer is not that it changes God, but rather that it changes us, it educates us. Petitionary prayers that are given to us by our tradition tell us what it is that we ought to want. And actually, when you start thinking about that, and you look through the petitionary prayers in the Siddur, it is actually quite interesting to see what are we instructed to ask for and what are we not instructed to ask for. For example, we are instructed to ask for parnasah and kalkala, for a basic livelihood. We should have food to eat. We should have a basic livelihood. It's very rare, or actually in most forms of Jewish prayer, pretty much never the case that we ask for wealth, for riches. We ask for enough. We ask for a livelihood. We don't ask for wealth. By the way, the one exception to that is that in late versions, historically late versions of the Ashkenazic prayer book, in the paragraph right before the blessing for the new moon that is recited on Saturday morning, once a month, we do ask among other things, we ask for osher v'chavod, for wealth and honor. But that's something that we ask for very much in passing in a much longer list, and it's only once a month. B, it's actually a very late addition to the Ashkenazic liturgy. It was added in early modern or the very late medieval times to the Ashkenazic liturgy, and it doesn't appear in all versions of the Ashkenazic liturgy. Nowadays, it's in the most common ones, but for example, it's not in the version of the Ashkenazic liturgy that is propounded by the Vilna Gra. Just take one example. It also, that paragraph does not appear outside of Ashkenazic liturgy. That is, it does not appear in the so-called Sephardic or Eidot Mizrach liturgy. It does not appear in the Jewish Italian liturgy or the Jewish Yemenite liturgies. There are a number of basically 4 or 5 main liturgical rites in Judaism, and that paragraph was only added very late in the game to the Ashkenazic liturgy. But petitionary prayer tells us what we should value and what we shouldn't value. By and large, we don't ask for wealth, for example. We don't ask for riches. Petitionary prayer initially can seem like it's selfish. But in a religion that prescribes the wording of our petitions, I think the opposite is the case. When we pray from a set liturgy, we're not asking for our own desires to be fulfilled. We are submitting ourselves to the tradition's version of what we should want. And thus I think that petitionary prayer becomes a form of musar, a form of self-discipline or self-instruction. If I can paraphrase and sort of turn upside down, the wording of a Jewish poet of more recent vintage, we know what we want, but the Siddur knows what we need. The Siddur knows what we need. And petitionary prayer tells us or reminds us what it is that really matters, what it is that we really should be talking about. That particular poet that I just mentioned, a contemporary of his, an older contemporary, Abraham Joshua Heschel, said something similar to what I'm getting at, and this is on the bottom of page 1 of the handout, when he says that prayer is a way to discern between the signal and the trivial, between the vital and the futile, by taking counsel with what we know about the will of God. Prayer clarifies our hopes and intentions. It helps us discover our true aspirations. It teaches us what to aspire for. Similarly, rightly understood then, prayer, far from being selfish, petitionary prayer engenders, I think, a sense of what we should want, and therefore also engenders a sense of thankfulness, what we should be thankful for. For that reason, Maimonides states quite explicitly in the Guide for the Perplexed, in a number of places, I give you one of those on the first page of the handout, that really petitionary prayer and praise are both a form of thanksgiving. He also says this in the Mishnah Torah explicitly, that of the 3 types of prayer, I put those in bold in the Hebrew, shevech, v'hodaya, uvakasha, praise, acknowledgement, and request, all of them are really a form of thanksgiving. They're all really a form of acknowledgement. Even when we're petitioning, we're not really talking to God. We're talking to ourselves, and we're reminding ourselves what we ought to be thankful for. Praise, too, is something in which we're reminding us what are the ways in which God is great, and what are the ways in which we should be thankful for God's greatness. So interestingly, I think for a rationalist, petitionary prayer and praise really don't make sense. And thus it makes sense that both in his law code, which I gave you in the Hebrew and the English, and in the Guide for the Perplexed, which I only gave you in the English translation, I didn't include the Arabic original, in both of those books, Maimonides says that, well, really all prayer is a form of thanksgiving. And thanksgiving is something that's useful for us. Thanking is useful not only for the person being thanked, but also, and maybe even most of all, for the person doing the thanking. Let me move on to another issue. This idea then that we're seeing this in 2 very different thinkers, in Maimonides and in Heschel, who are enormously different Jewish thinkers. I think what we're seeing is an idea that prayer is really a form of self-limitation. Prayer moves us away from self-reflection and brings us towards something that's even more important in a Jewish view of prayer. Prayer also allows us to enact the core Jewish value of anava, or humility. Fixed formulaic prayers whose wording is given to us, really are all about, in a sense, discipline, self-transcendence, and thus about sacrifice. Judaism requires us to recite specific prayers at particular moments, or at least within particular time frames. I mean, not at an exact moment, but the morning, the afternoon. And there's some flexibility about the wording, but by and large, certainly the structure of the prayers and much of the phrasing of the prayers is fixed. Certainly the structure of the prayer is completely fixed. For traditional Jewish prayer, we don't choose the timing, and we don't really choose the structure, and only to a small extent can we choose the wording. Granted that halakha might allow us to skip a little bit here, to paraphrase a little bit there, but it remains the case that by reciting, let's say, the shacharit service, the morning service, in the morning, and the mincha service, the afternoon service, in the afternoon, following the matbeah shel tefillah, following the structure that is required, by doing all that, we're surrendering a bit of our freedom, because we're using the structure and the wording that comes from the Siddur, and we are surrendering a bit of our time. We can't just go and do shacharit later in the day. We have to do it by a certain time before noon, the Shema even a bit earlier than that. And as a result, Jewish prayer and prayer in many other traditions, Jewish prayer allows us to speak of something that's at the top of page 2 of the handout. And I'm quoting here from a very interesting book by two scholars from Smith College, Philip and Carol Zaleski, who in a book written just a few years ago, a decade or so ago, a book with the title Prayer, a History, they speak of the self-effacement needed in order to say prayers in unison with others, a willed anonymity that the great Catholic mystic Thomas Merton described as the complete opposite of the logic of the world. The Zaleskis go on to say, to perceive oneself as a part of a book authored by God, or I might add, as a part of a book authored by a tradition, authored by a larger community that precedes us, to do that, to learn that one is written and not the writer, passive, not active, in relation to the creation, all these things serve as gestures of submission. One cannot draw near to God without emptying oneself. When one is nothing, then God is old. I'm sorry, God is all. So the truth is that when we use the Sidur's structure and wording and timing, it becomes the case actually that in a funny way, prayer shrinks us. I think a lot of people nowadays think that prayer should somehow expand us or make us more expansive. And maybe in some ways that's true, but it is also the case that in a tradition such as Judaism that has a prescribed liturgy, prayer has the important effect, the important goal of shrinking us. That may be surprising and uncomfortable, I think, for some modern Western people, but it's a very important aspect of Jewish prayer. Insofar as prayer shrinks us, I think that traditional Jewish prayer is doing something very, very vital in Judaism, which is that it's limiting our haughtiness. It's limiting the extent to which we see ourselves as great. And this is a side of prayer that Abraham Joshua Heschel in particular picks up on. So I'd like to, in the middle of page 2, I'd like to just read a bit of sentences chosen from different places in which Heschel talks about prayer, where he's really teaching a modern audience about an authentic Jewish view of prayer. He writes, "How grateful am I that there is a duty to worship, a law to remind my distraught mind that it's time to disregard my ego for at least a moment. Prayer may be described as a shift of the center of living from self-consciousness to self-surrender. We submit our interests to God's concern and seek to be allied with what is ultimately right. What makes prayer possible is our ability to affiliate our minds with patterns of fixed texts, to surrender to their meanings. Man submits to the words. The focus of the prayer is not the self." Going through these different quotations, it's interesting to notice the vocabulary that Heschel uses to describe true Jewish prayer. Duty, disregard my ego, surrender, submit, surrender, submit, submit. Fixed texts, not the self. I think that Heschel is reminding us of this core value of humility, of making ourselves smaller, that is central to traditional Judaism. Oddly enough, and I think that for many modern people this comes as a surprise, but the fact of the matter is I think that authentic prayer in a liturgical tradition such as Judaism or Islam or Hinduism or Catholicism is not about self-actualizing. If we think that the goal of prayer is to make us healthier, calmer, more centered, we're getting it backwards. If that's what we're looking for, we're getting it exactly backwards. Prayer is not about centering the self. Prayer, as Heschel describes it, prayer is about decentering the self. Prayer is fundamentally about submission. Here it's worth remembering that in Judaism, what we do every morning and every evening, when we recite the Shema is we are supposed to be accepting what the rabbis called Ol Malchut Shamayim and Ol Malchut. It's about submitting ourselves to an Ol. Ol is a Hebrew word that means yoke. We're supposed to submit ourselves to the yoke of divine kingship and to the yoke of the commandments. And I think Heschel, in the sentences that I chose, is trying to remind us of that concept of submission to a yoke. And this is something I think that modern American, modern Western Jews have a great deal of difficulty with. And I think that in some ways we sort of pervert prayer when we think that prayer is about ourself. It's about centering the self. No. Jewish prayer is about decentering the self. And we've sort of perverted prayer if we think that it's about us and that it does something good to us. It does something that makes us calmer or more centered. I think it's also interesting to note here that, I mean, Judaism, modern Western Judaism does that a lot. We take the word mitzvah, for example, mitzvah, which means commandment. And in a lot of popular American Jewish English, we use the word mitzvah to mean good deed, as if though it were like it's a voluntary good deed. It's a really nice thing to do to somebody or for somebody. But that's not what the word mitzvah in Hebrew means. Mitzvah means a commandment, something that we do not because we feel like being nice, but because we understand that we're commanded to do it. If you can do it out of a love of being nice too, that's even better. But whether or not you want to give charity, whether or not you feel like it, you still have to give charity on a regular basis anyway. American Judaism has sort of emptied the word mitzvah of its essential essential content. I think it's also interesting to note that popular American culture in the last couple of decades has done to the Sanskrit word yoga exactly what modern American Judaism has done to the word mitzvah. The Sanskrit word yoga means yoke. In fact, the Sanskrit word yoga is cognate to the English word yoke. Sanskrit and English are both Indo-European languages, and we're really getting the same word there. I think in a lot of a modern American culture, we use yoga as something that makes us more centered, healthier, and that's not a bad thing. I've been having this like problem with my shoulder and my neck, some sort of like arthritis, and I'm thinking maybe I wanted something that's been suggested to me is the possibility of doing yoga that actually might help with this ache that I'm having over here. If you're doing that, that's a fine thing, and you should continue doing it, and you should be healthy, and you should do whatever you need to be healthy and more comfortable. But still, I think it is just worth noting that those of us who sometimes use yoga for our own benefit, we're doing yoga exactly backwards. Yoga is all, in Hinduism, yoga is about submitting to a yoke that exists in a cosmos that is much bigger and more significant than we are as individuals. I do think it's interesting that American Judaism did to the word mitzvah what American popular culture has done to the Sanskrit word yoga. There's a lesson in there somewhere. So we've arrived, I think, at some answers to the question, why is davening so hard for us in the modern world? It's because prayer, tefillah, davening, is really all about submission. And we Americans, our culture does not respect submission. The culture around us admires us, and rightly and positively so, for finding our own voice. But Jewish prayer tells us to sacrifice some of our own voice and to adopt the voice of tradition and community. Modern culture tends to emphasize me. Traditional Jewish culture tends to emphasize we. The modern West glorifies humanity. Traditional Judaism has an optimistic and positive view of what it means to be a human being, but it doesn't glorify humanity. It only glorifies the God who created humanity, or at least it glorifies God far more than it glorifies humanity itself. In short, in our place and time, Jewish prayer is profoundly countercultural. Jewish prayer is fundamentally at odds with American culture, which is about self-invention. I think in many ways, self-invention is like the great American value. for many of us, this is not true for African Americans, it's not true for Native Americans, but for the majority of Americans, it is the case that our parents or our grandparents or our great-great-great-great-great-grandparents came here in order to invent themselves anew. Huck Finn is the great American novel because it's about two individuals who didn't accept what their society said they had to be. And so they got on a raft and they went off into this big river to go invent themselves anew. Walt Whitman, the quintessential American poet, celebrates and sings himself. Those are all wonderful, wonderful parts of American culture that I think all of us deeply, deeply value. But in tefillah, in Jewish prayer, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be doing something, profoundly un-American. We're supposed to be celebrating the Creator and circumscribing ourselves. We're supposed to be giving up our voice and accepting the voice of tradition as it comes to us in the Siddur and adopting the tradition's words for our words. It's really telling that in Judaism, even if you daven by yourself, if you don't go to synagogue, if you don't go to minyan, but you recite the service by yourself at home, even then you're still involved in communal prayer. Prayer in Judaism is almost always communal prayer, because even if you're by yourself, hundreds of miles from the nearest minyan, you're davening out of the same prayer book that some minyan is using at around more or less the same time of the day. And you're mostly davening using the words we, anachnu, otanu. There's relatively little, there's some, but there's relatively little I. There's relatively little ani or oti in Jewish prayer, which focuses much, much more on we, on us, on anachnu and otanu. So what I've tried to show today is that the ideas underlying Jewish prayer are uncomfortably and profoundly at odds with much of our own culture. Now, identifying the ways in which this is the case, I think, might allow us to think through our relationship to the Siddur, to the Machzor, and to the daily discipline that is traditional Jewish prayer. I've tried to identify some of the stumbling blocks that I think trip us up as we gather and as we attempt to pray. And I've also tried to point to some underappreciated psychological and theological and moral depths in our system of fixed prayers, in which we learn to adopt the prayers of the tradition rather than only speaking in our own voice. I do think that we modern Jews, including very much myself, need to work hard at prayer and need to take prayer more seriously than we tend to. And I say that as myself. I mean, even while I'm davening, I realize I should be paying more attention and taking prayer more seriously that I'm doing while I'm doing it. I hope that thinking through these issues will make it easier for some of us to begin to take prayer more seriously and to take prayer more Jewishly, to understand prayer in a way that is authentically Jewish, even if we have to work at making it authentically our own. One of the most famous prayers in Ashkenazic liturgy, which we're going to recite 3 times, where the Shliach Tzibor, the Shliach or Shlichat Tzibor will say at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services, begins with the words, Hineni he'ani mima'as, bati la'amod u'lhitchanen lefanecha, af al pi she'eni chadai v'hagun lechach. Here I am, poor in deeds, humble. I've come, God, to pray in your presence, even though I'm unworthy. The great thing about that particular prayer, and really about all prayer in a liturgical tradition such as our own, is that realizing that we're unworthy to pray, realizing that we are going to fail at this, is precisely what makes us able to pray at all. So I hope that come Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and for that matter, come every other day of the week for the rest of the year, that we can give it a try. Toda rabah, and we've got time for questions.
Great, thank you. What questions could there possibly be about that? It's so straightforward. George, I'm going to ask you to unmute and ask your question.
To get back to your original question, my thoughts are, and I appreciate your thoughts, are one, the pandemic of Jewish liberal ignorance about the meaning and understanding of our prayers. And number two, the need of some liturgical leaders to speed through minion prayers. We don't have time. It has to be done in 15 minutes between 6 and 6:15 in the evening to get through these prayers. So as a practical matters, how do we overcome our own lack of understanding of the prayers, what they really mean, and how do we then have time to literally daven with kavanah to do that at the various services? So those are my questions.
Great questions. So first, regarding a lack of understanding of prayer, I guess I have two different kinds of answers. I think that, in many ways, the Siddur is a closed book. It is a difficult book for many modern Jews. How do we open it up? Well, one answer is really the lecture that I just gave today. I think that part of the reason it's a closed book is because before we even open the book, we need to understand what's the point of a liturgical tradition? What's the point of a tradition such as Judaism or Catholicism or Islam, in which the more or less the structure, timing, and wording of prayer is set out in advance before I was born? And I was trying to give today a sense of why it is that it makes sense theologically, psychologically, ethically to open up this book. Because there is a great deal of theological, ethical, and psychological value in deciding, I'm going to let the Siddur speak for me. At some level, to use kind of real frank language, in a way, part of what the Siddur kind of tells us is to be quiet. To be quiet and adopt a voice that is older and wiser and greater than our own, and to work at trying to make it our own. So I think that if we start off, before we even open the Siddur, we understand that that's why it makes sense to open the Siddur, as opposed to just kind of sitting there and thinking of our own words, what our own words would be if we were to compose the prayers. If we understand that, we're on a much better path to be able to understand what the Siddur is doing. In addition to that, the fact is, though, that when you get to the actual wording of the Siddur, there are a lot of spectacular resources nowadays that provide good commentaries on the Siddur and reflections on the Siddur. I really think that the new Siddurim that Eddie Feld has edited for the conservative movement, along with a number of people some of whom might be in on this Zoom session, or have taught on some of these Zoom sessions, the explanations and especially the reflections that are on the side of the page all the way through that are very, very useful for allowing us to reflect on the meaning of the prayers, to take up the challenge of the prayers, and to begin to make those wording our own. There are a number of other commentaries on the Siddur. The My People's Prayer Book series is really nice in the way that it has multiple commentaries by several different contemporary Jewish scholars from different perspectives on the same page. The commentary that's available in the older conservative Siddur, Sim Shalom. Julie, do you remember the name of the commentary that, it's right over there, but I have to take my headphones off to go get it.
I'll find it.
You'll find it. It's by Jules Harlow's commentary is what I'm talking about.
Are you talking about Or Chadash?
Is it Or Hadash? Yeah. Okay. So Or Hadash, the commentary on the older conservative Siddur. It's the Siddur that was edited by Jules Harlow. Separately, he published a commentary on it. If you can get the hardcover edition, get the hardcover because the print's bigger. There are a lot of resources out there that allow people, I think, to study and to begin working at making the prayers their own. I mean, like everything else in Judaism, it takes work. Judaism is not a totally, it does not come fully prepackaged. You have to work at it, but there are a lot of great resources out there in English that allow people to do that. I think that there's also always going to be a tension between, the best praying with the highest level of kavanah and practicality. Judaism is not a tradition in which we encourage monasticism. in Catholicism, in Eastern Orthodoxy, even in some types of Anglicanism, there is the tradition, also in Hinduism, there is the tradition of monasticism, where a person can literally devote 20 hours a day to prayer. They don't have a job, and they have decided to live in poverty so that they can pray all the time. You do get that in Hinduism, and Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodoxy. We don't have that in Judaism. By and large, one doesn't have that in most Protestant forms of Christianity or in Islam. And so there, it's legitimate to realize, like, yeah, I'd like to pray well, but like, I got a 6:15, I got a 6:15 bus to catch, and I've got a family I've got to get home to and have dinner with, and so we shouldn't feel guilty sometimes for rushing through prayer. I think sometimes I myself do find that it's often easier for me to daven by myself than in a minyan. Because I can go at my own pace. On Shabbat, I usually daven with a minyan, but there are some Shabbatot that I do decide to stay home, in part because I think I'm going to daven better. And I'm still part of the community in the sense that I'm still davening the same words that the community is reciting. But as with anything hard, one will have better days and worse days, and I don't think there's anything wrong with realizing, well, sometimes we got to be practical, and we're just going to, we got to get through this. And maybe sometimes davening, usually with community, but sometimes on one's own, is a way of trying to meet both of those legitimate needs.
It is indeed orthodox. So we have just 3 minutes left in our formal time, so we'll take one more question. Then I think, Professor Sommer, you said you could stay a little bit later.
Sure,
so,
yeah.
For those, thank you. So for those who can stay, we'll do a little more Q&A till 2:30. But for those who can't, I'll in advance thank you for joining us. And we are not meeting next Monday as it's Labor Day. So we'll hopefully see you 2 weeks from today. Okay, Barbara, I'll ask you to unmute.
Here, okay. It's done. Go ahead. It's actually. Let me ask one question. What you're saying is the Jewish tradition is the recent Jewish tradition. In the times of the Talmud, they made up the prayers all along.
Not exactly, not exactly. Already in the Talmudic era, the topics, the structure, and the order of prayer was laid out. And there was already traditional phrasing that you would use to fill in those structures. So you're correct that in the Talmudic period, they didn't have a siddur like we have today, where the words are very specifically printed. But they did have already the matbeah shel tefillah. When you got up to do what the rabbis called tefillah, prayer, what we call the Amidah Prayer, this Shemona Esrei prayer, you had to do it at a certain time, or within a certain time frame, 2 or then ultimately 3, according to the opinion that became most widespread, 3 times a day, within specific time frames, 3 times a day. And when you got up to do it, you had to actually literally get up to do it. You had to do it standing, not sitting, assuming that you physically one is able to stand. And one had to do it according to a certain order. First, you talked about avot. You mentioned Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then you went on to talk about gvurot, and you talked about techiyat hametim. That is, you talked about God's might. You talked about the resurrection of the dead. Then you went on to talk about holiness. Then you went on to talk about knowledge, and you went through all 18 or ultimately 19 topics that the rabbis said you had to go through, and you went through it in that particular order. So you're right that the exact wording that you might have used in the Talmudic era was the exact wording was free and flexible, but only within very, very specific limitations. And it would be, I think, authentic today to go back to using different wording, perhaps, but deciding, you know what, I'm not going to do the 19 benedictions today. I'm going to do 17 today because I'm not really feeling like I believe in bodily resurrection today. So I'm going to skip that one. No, Judaism says, even if you're having trouble with the idea of bodily resurrection, you got to mention it. Because the fact that you're having trouble with it, that means that that's something that you have to work on now that you can just skip it. So no, I think that what I'm talking about is not just recent Jewish tradition, it goes certainly back to the beginning of the rabbinic era.
If I may, Professor Sommer, I think I think the point stands that at some point, right, it came from someone's heart or a group of people to compose our prayer, right? So you could argue that at some original level, there was a different conception of prayer, that it wasn't sort of a framework that precedes you, that we put onto you, that you have to somehow conform to.
To some degree, that framework that the rabbis created, it was invented at some point in time. It actually probably evolved over a long period of time. But you go back to, 500 BCE, they did not have that framework at that point in time. So that is true. At the same time, I think even if you go back to the biblical period and you look at biblical characters and how they are described as praying, in some ways, their prayer is spontaneous, and yet even their prayers do follow patterns. The patterns aren't set out specifically, they aren't articulated specifically, but if you go through example after example, you'll see that the characters, consciously or unconsciously, were following patterns. It's a great scholar named Moshe Greenberg, Zichrono Livracha, one of the most illustrious graduates of JTS, who wrote a book about this, Biblical Prose Prayer. It's a very short book that was actually recently republished. You can go to Amazon and buy it. It's quite inexpensive, and it's a very short book called Biblical Prose Prayer, where he goes and shows that even what seem to be the spontaneous free prayers that you find in the Bible do in fact follow patterns. Similarly, the book of Psalms is a book in which there's a lot of traditional themes and phraseology. What the psalmists did is they were not poets who were creating an altogether new poetic prayer. They were always taking traditional phrasing that was out there and putting it together, following certain patterns, but putting it together in a new way. So that I think even when we go back to the earliest periods of Jewish or Israelite history, even then there already were patterns, there already were structures that the individual consciously or unconsciously was fitting into.
Thank you. Carolyn.
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so my question was, years ago, I was introduced to a distinction between prayer and worship, where prayer was more what you did on your own and worship was what you did communally. Is that something that people still think about or make that distinction?
Mm-hmm. So it depends on how you're using the English words. I think that in a more narrow sense, some people use the word prayer to refer to, especially to petitionary prayer, in which you're asking for something. And worship might be used more for praise, where you're not necessarily asking for something. I tend to be a little loose about my own terminology. I tend to use the terms interchangeably, although really, I think if you look it up in an English language dictionary, what I'm calling prayer or worship generally divides down into prayer on the one hand, which is petition, worship, which is praise. I'm not 100% sure where one would put thanksgiving in that case. I think it's often the case also that people who are talking about this want to introduce certain conceptual distinctions. And one conceptual distinction that a person might introduce is, let's say, communal fixed stuff versus more spontaneous individual stuff. And maybe it may be the case, I'm offhand not familiar with this, it may be the case that some people would use prayer for one of those and worship for the other. Different people might use the vocabulary differently. The distinction, the conceptual distinction, is an important one. And for all that I was saying today about the importance of fixed liturgical prayer whose structures and to great extent wording is set by the tradition, it nonetheless is the case in Judaism that, of course, one can have individual personal prayers anytime one wants to, and that's a praiseworthy thing in addition to the communal prayers. In fact, there's a tradition in Judaism that at the end of the Amidah prayer, that that's an appropriate time for you to come up with your own particular prayers in your own words, in your own language. Maybe it won't even be in words the way that you're particularly doing it. Now, it tends to happen all the time in Judaism. Barbara's companion was alluding to this earlier. It says Barbara, so I don't know what your name is, unfortunately, I'm sorry. It tends to happen in Judaism. Even the fixed formal prayers, most Siddurim actually now have for many centuries published the fixed individual prayer that you would otherwise recite. That's the part that begins Eloheinu tzor l'shoni me'ra. God, guard my lips from speaking badly about somebody. But really, what's even better then is not to recite that, but to recite your own words at that point, or any other point of the day. Any time of the day that you're in any location other than the bathroom, which is the one time of the day that you should not actually pray. But it's a praiseworthy thing to have a more personal communication with God. And in some types of Judaism, that aspect, unfortunately, has been lost. In other types, it really is highlighted. In Bratslaver Hasidus, in the Hasidic group of the Bratslaver Hasidim, personal individual prayer that you address to God as your parent, more specifically for them as your father, that is a very praiseworthy act. I don't know if some of you saw the movie Ushpizin. If you haven't seen the movie Ushpizin, then during Sukkot or before Sukkot, go to Netflix or Amazon or whatever and watch it. It's a wonderful movie about some Bratslaver Hasidim, and you see them doing this. It's really quite interesting to see how personal prayer is a huge part of the life of the Bratslaver, or Breslov, I should say, the Breslov Hasidim. It's a huge part in Breslov Hasidus, in addition to the formal fixed prayers.
I did want to just ask, comment in addition that when you think about Kabbalah and Kavanah, I think some of what you're saying is try it, you'll like it, and you'll learn something as you pay attention, that the prayers can develop meaning for you, even though they seem so structured and written by somebody else.
Correct. I think that a very essential part of traditional Judaism is don't wait for the meaning to come. Start doing it and wait for the meaning to develop and to evolve and to emerge. And that's something that Heschel really emphasized in his writings. It's something that Franz Rosenzweig, the great Jewish philosopher from the first half of the 20th century, emphasized in his writings. Both of them are really pushing back against Martin Buber, a philosopher whose approach was like, don't do anything until you really feel truly commanded, which Heschel and Rosenzweig both argued correctly was really a mistake. It was a profoundly un-Jewish way of thinking about these things. Do it every day, and then the meaning will emerge.
Let's go to Jim, and I see so many hands raised, and I'm sorry that we won't have time to address them. I'm hesitant to tell people to put things in the chat because the chat is already kind of blowing up, but I actually am curious to know all the questions that we're not going to get to. I think it might be helpful for us actually to know what we didn't get to that people are interested in. It can help inform how we think about maybe offering future sessions on prayer. So I'm going to call in one or two people to the extent that we can fit in, but do go ahead if we don't have time for your question and put it in the chat, and we'll see in some other form we can get to you.
Okay.
She is
Jim.
Thank you. How do we deal with prayers that we don't agree with, such as Mechayeh HaMeitim, to make the dead alive again?
Interesting question. Fine question. Not one that bothers me, since I have absolutely no problem with the idea of Tchiyat HaMeitim, and I've never understood why modern people do. But I understand that for whatever reasons that are unfathomable to me, some people don't believe in Tchiyat HaMeitim, or in life after death, or the resurrection of the dead. But the question, if it's not that paragraph, it's some other paragraph. I think all of us have some paragraph that it's hard for us to really agree with. And I think I would say a few different things. Number one, I think that is part of the positive challenge of traditional Jewish prayer, is recognizing that I'm not in charge of everything. And just because I personally have some difficulty here, that doesn't mean that I should not say this. Maybe there's an important religious idea here that that would enrich my life if I could truly embrace it. And so maybe I need to say these words until I am able to embrace it. And I do find that my life is finally enriched by it. Part of what I've been saying in this lecture is that, one aspect of liturgical prayer is it gets us to kind of be quiet and listen to the tradition. And that might be one of the places where I decide, okay, I'm supposed to be a religious individual. I'm supposed to be engaging in musar, in self-education and self-discipline. I'm supposed to be trying to become a little bit more humble, a little bit more ani. I'm supposed to display more anava, more humility. Well, maybe in that case, it's worthwhile for me to say words that I can't fully believe in, because that shows that I am actually submitting myself to something bigger than me. Now, having said that, I think for each of us, there's going to be yesh gvul. There's going to be a limit that we don't go beyond. I do say, for example, the traditional Musaf service. I say the traditional Musaf service that talks about the reinstatement of sacrifices and looking forward to and asking God to do that, even though I myself don't really like the sight of blood and I don't think I would enjoy it very much, and I have some ethical qualms with it. I do say that because I think that that's something that, maybe that's an area where I've got to be quiet. I've got to shut myself up and let the tradition speak. And maybe that's a way of limiting myself. But there are places I won't go. In the morning, the preliminary service in the morning, the old language of Shalo Asani Isha, thanking God for not making me a woman. No, I don't say that. There I use the conservative wording, Shasani Israel, who made me a Jew. Shasani, actually I say Shasani Kirtzono, from the traditional prayer book, was God who has made me as God wanted to make me. And I say Shasani Mitzalmo, who made me in God's image. But I won't, ethically, I'm not going to go that far. There's a certain point at which I do say, okay, I've got to change the words. In my particular case, that's pretty much the only place, those 3 lines in the morning service. But like everything else, there's a bit of there's a dialogue. Judaism is always dialogical. We modern Jews, we love the fact that Judaism is dialogical, and we especially love the part where we get to talk. A lot of my own teaching it consists of trying to remind us that in the dialogue that is Judaism, sometimes we modern individuals have to be quiet too. But ultimately that's a dialogue, and each of us as an individual does have to decide, how far can I go? If saying Mechaye Hamitim is just impossible, then I think that there are liturgical alternatives that have become somewhat traditional over the last 150 years. In the Reform prayer book, in the Reconstructionist prayer book, there's the language Mechaye HaKol. One can still say almost the exact same paragraph, but change just a few words the way that is done in a Reconstructionist or a Reform prayer book. And it's even done in one conservative prayer book in Israel where they give you 2 options. I think that's if to be intellectually honest and spiritually honest, you need to do that, one can still recite that paragraph with that minor emendation.
We have 1 minute left. Alan, can you give us your question in a few words, and Professor Sommer can squeeze his answer in?
Yeah, you bet. It's as much an observation as anything else. The language of the prayer book is metaphorical. And I think part of the challenge that we face is setting aside God and setting aside structure. The fact that the metaphors of prayer were created in a time when kingship meant something different to the people, for example. And now I am reading a prayer book which is metaphorical about God and reading the metaphors in a metaphorical way in order to make them meaningful for me. And so the poetry itself becomes a challenge.
I think I agree with you that the language is a challenge, the poetry is a challenge, the way that God is imagined is a challenge. I think that we modern Jews often are too quick to say, that old stuff doesn't work for me, so I'm going to come up with something new on my own. And what I'm saying is a more authentically Jewish way of confronting the challenge is not pushing the challenge aside and coming up with a new prayer book, But the authentically Jewish thing to do is to grapple with the challenge and to understand, maybe this old foreign idea, let's say, of kingship and of sovereignty, maybe it really has something to teach me. And I think that that particular one does. Maybe the idea of Ol Malchut Shamayim, of accepting the yoke of divine kingship, of divine sovereignty, and submitting myself, making myself more submissive, more humble, maybe that is a religiously worthwhile thing to do that is hard for me as an American, but maybe Judaism knows what it's talking about when it tries to get me to make that move.
Thank you so much, Professor Sommer. This is clearly a tremendously challenging, in a good way, session for people. So many of us feel very invested in prayer at the same time as finding it so challenging, and that was the premise of your whole session. So you've really, really given us a lot to think about, and I just want to thank you and thank everyone for joining us. Do you want to?
Thanks, Julia. Actually, thank you to everyone who's participated. I hope that this has been useful. It's been useful for me just thinking through all of this. Julia, I wonder, just before we close everything, is there a way to save the chat? Because
yes.
I see there's a lot of stuff and I wasn't able to see it.
The chat saves, which is why I asked people to put their unasked questions in the chat.
Absolutely. So if you could send that to me somehow, that'd be really great. I'd love to be able to read through, because I'm sure I'll do this class in some context elsewhere, and I'd really love to read through the questions, even if I can't respond to them directly. So I'd love to be able to see them and to be able to learn from them. One thing about, the great thing about teaching is, I mean, they say this, but it's actually really true, is that you learn a lot by teaching, and you learn a lot from people's responses. Often people ask questions that, like, it's a great question, I know the answer, but I never would have thought of that answer until the question was asked. So anyway, I'd love to be able to look through the chat if you could save that for me somehow.
Sure.
Thank you very much, and wishing everybody a Shana Tova Umetuka, and a good year, a year of health and safety for all of us, and and a year of humility and decency for our country as well. Toda rabah and Shana Tova. Bye-bye.
Shana Tova.